Welcome to my Single Mom Mini Stories channel. Please subscribe my channel and listen my stories. Michael Harrow hadn't meant to lift his head. He'd been watching condensation trail down his water glass, silently counting the seconds, carefully not looking at the empty chair across from him. The voice that crossed the space between their tables wasn't loud or assured. It sounded like someone asking permission to take up space at all. Your blind date didn't show up either. He looked up slowly, irritation flickering and then fading when he saw her. A woman alone. Phone turned face down. Shoulders loose but tired. Not fishing. Not performing. Just telling the truth. Claire Bennett hadn't come here planning to interrupt a stranger's disappointment. She almost swallowed the words, almost let the silence close over both tables. But after checking her phone one last time and seeing nothing, the quiet felt heavier than being stood up. Saying something felt lighter than pretending none of it mattered. If you believe in small, ordinary acts of kindness and how quietly they can redirect a life, you're in the right place. Stories like this exist because one simple sentence can open a door neither person knew was there. Michael hesitated. People usually talked at him, not to him. They expected certainty, decisions, solutions. This woman expected nothing. She was simply acknowledging what was already obvious. That disarmed him. Yeah, he said at last, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Looks like that. No excuses about work. No jokes about traffic. Just two strangers naming the same small sting. Somehow that made the air around them feel dangerous, like honesty might loosen something neither of them controlled. The waiter walked by with professional indifference, skirting two tables meant for conversations that would never happen. The restaurant hummed in low light and soft music, the sort of place designed for important evenings. Michael hadn't noticed any of it before. Now everything felt closer, sharper, as if the room had stepped in around him. Claire smiled, not because any of this was amusing, but because the truth had finally been said aloud. She didn't ask his name. She didn't offer reassurance. She simply stayed there, fully present. Presence right then felt rare. Michael wouldn't understand until much later that her whisper had already shifted something inside him. Not his heart, not his future. Something quieter he'd been careful not to disturb. As they sat with a silence that, for the first time that evening, was shared instead of separate, neither of them recognized how large this small moment really was. Life hides its turning points in places like this. They don't look important until everything around them begins to move. Michael Harrow was 42. A self-made millionaire and the kind of CEO people called focused, when what they meant was emotionally unavailable. He ran a mid-sized financial technology company that processed millions of dollars a day. Shareholders trusted him. Employees respected him. Most nights he ate alone. Success had filled his calendar and quietly stripped the rest of his life bare. This dinner wasn't a celebration, or even a date he'd looked forward to. It was an assignment from his therapist, a woman who had calmly told him that isolation had become less a habit and more a hiding place. He never admitted to being tired. He said he was busy. Meetings, calls, flights, deadlines. There was always another number or negotiation that made introspection unnecessary. So he had agreed reluctantly to a blind date. To one evening that wasn't about quarterly results. Now, sitting in front of an untouched place setting, abandoned by someone who hadn't even bothered to send an excuse, he felt something closer to confirmation than hurt. Even when he stepped outside his routine, life still didn't quite meet him. What unsettled him wasn't disappointment. It was the fact he wasn't particularly angry. Across from him but at another table, Claire carried a different kind of weight. At 34, she was not lonely in the way people like to imagine single mothers. Her days were dense, not empty. She worked part-time at a local nonprofit, made lunches each morning, checked homework each night, and did her best to keep her 11-year-old son, Evan, safe in a world that didn't slow down just because they needed it to. Dating had slipped to the bottom of her list, not because she didn't want companionship, but because she had learned to value peace over excitement. Quiet evenings with a predictable routine had become more precious than butterflies. Saying yes to this blind date had felt reckless and oddly hopeful at the same time. A coworker had insisted she deserved something for herself. Claire had agreed mostly because she wanted to believe that part of her life wasn't closed forever. Now, sitting alone with minutes stretching and no explanation arriving, she didn't feel rejected so much as exposed. She had stepped briefly outside the structure that kept her life moving and found she had very little protection out here. Their conversation didn't begin with charm. It began with truth. Michael noticed right away. Claire wasn't trying to smooth the edges of the evening or fill the silence with nervous chatter. She spoke like someone who had finally stopped auditioning for other people's approval. Without realizing it, he lowered his guard. For once, he wasn't the man people presented themselves to. He was just a man who'd been left waiting. Claire recognized something tightly controlled about him. That slightly distant look carried by people who shoulder responsibility and don't remember how to set it down. She'd seen it enough times to know what it meant. She didn't ask what he did. She didn't need a title to understand him. What mattered was the way he listened. As if her words weren't background noise, but something to be taken in and held. They stayed with small topics, bad coffee, missed buses, first meetings that made everyone wish for second chances. Beneath the surface, both felt a current they didn't name. Each of them lived inside structures built years earlier, shaped by choices that had hardened into habits. Both knew how to survive on their own. Neither was used to being quietly seen. They weren't fixing anything. They were simply allowing themselves to exist in front of someone else without explanation. That unfamiliar ease was its own kind of risk. Michael felt something in his chest loosen that wasn't quite relief and wasn't attraction. Felt like recognition. He hadn't realized how long it had been since a conversation wasn't attached to a goal, an agenda, an outcome. Claire wasn't asking him to impress her. She wasn't asking for anything. That, somehow, was harder than any negotiation he'd ever led. She noticed, too, how natural it felt to leave space between sentences. No rush to entertain. No pressure to defend her choices. The quiet itself felt generous. Still, a part of her stayed braced. She knew from experience that the moment she leaned too far toward comfort, it could be taken away. She reminded herself that this was just a conversation in a restaurant. Nothing more. Even as quietly it became more than that. What neither of them saw was how this small connection was already rearranging things. Not into romance, not into rescue, but into something slower and more dangerous to the careful balances they'd built. While Claire's phone lay face down and silent, the night waited, holding back a turn neither of them could yet see. Her phone didn't ring dramatically. It simply lit up between them, screen glowing. Claire glanced at it and knew instantly who it was from. Parents learn how to read school notifications before they even open them. She felt the moment shorten. The message was simple. Evan had stayed late for an after-school activity, missed the last bus, and was now at the front office waiting. Supervised, safe. But only for a limited time. No crisis. No danger. Just a crack in the routine she relied on. For Claire that was enough. She had built their life on dependability. When the pattern shifted, she showed up. That was non-negotiable. Michael caught the slight tightening in her shoulders, the way her focus moved someplace else. Years of reading boardrooms had taught him to see small changes first. He didn't immediately ask what was wrong. He waited. That patience mattered more than a flood of questions. Claire explained without drama or apology. This wasn't a tragic interruption. It was simply life. Evan came first, not because he couldn't handle the world, but because he mattered more than anything in it. She gathered her things without rushing, giving the evening the weight it deserved, even as she prepared to leave. Michael reached toward his wallet, reflexively offering to cover the bill. She declined with a small shake of her head, not defensive, not offended. She paid her share, rose, and met his eyes with something that looked very much like gratitude, not for the food, but for the way he hadn't made the night feel smaller than it was. Before stepping away, she told him quietly that while the evening hadn't matched the plan, it hadn't been wasted. She thanked him for listening without trying to fix her problems. For a heartbeat, the low restaurant noise drew back, and her words landed deeper than he expected. He watched her walk out, feeling something unfamiliar close around his chest. It wasn't disappointment exactly. It was the unsettling realization that her leaving had become important. The seat across from him stayed empty, but now it felt less abandoned and more unfinished, like a thought that hadn't been fully spoken. Outside in the cool air, Claire didn't glance back. She wasn't trying to hold on to the moment or turn it into something dramatic. Still, she carried it with her, folded between duty and an old, quiet longing. Neither of them knew it yet, but that ordinary decision, leaving without fanfare, without promises, had already nudged both of their lives onto a slightly different path. Michael stayed at the table long after she left. Not stunned, not broken. Just still. Moving felt unnecessary. He realized how rare it was for someone to walk away from him without wanting something. No introductions, no favors, no implied opportunities. The emptiness in front of him suddenly felt louder than their conversation had been. On the drive home, city lights streaked by his windshield while his mind replayed the evening in fragments. Not the specific phrases but the pauses, the way she hadn't shifted herself to fit what he represented. How she had spoken as if his attention wasn't a prize to be won. He was used to people adjusting themselves around him. With her, nothing had repositioned. That unaltered self-possession made him feel more visible than any flattery ever had. The next morning he returned to the office routine. Stacked meetings, profitability charts, strategy decks, expectations at every turn. He did his job. He made decisions. He delegated. Yet under the familiar rhythm, something pushed against the edges. He started noticing things he usually filtered out. The exhaustion at the edge of a junior analyst's smile, the way a project manager's shoulders sagged when no one was looking, the thinness in the jokes people used to disguise being overwhelmed. Meanwhile, Claire's day unfolded as it always did. Work, school pickup plans, dinner to figure out, laundry that never quite stayed done. She didn't spin the previous night into something it wasn't. Fantasizing had never been a luxury she allowed herself. Still, a softness lingered. A feeling of having been quietly understood without a long backstory. For someone who lived at default strength, the memory of not needing to perform stayed with her longer than she wanted to admit. That afternoon, when she finally reached the school and Evan came barreling toward her with more words than breath, she anchored herself in the life she had built. Listening to him describe his day, she was reminded that responsibility wasn't a cage. It was a choice she made every morning. Still, beneath the steady responses and practiced calm, there was a small ache, a reminder that she was also a whole person apart from motherhood, and that part of her had briefly been seen. In his penthouse that evening, Michael forgot about dinner altogether. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, phone in hand, scrolling through nothing. For the first time in years, the quiet of his home felt less like solitude and more like being sealed off. When had achievement stopped meaning security and started meaning distance? Across town they held the same unspoken weight in different rooms. Neither of them reached for the other. Neither searched for a name, a profile, a way back. They simply sat with the exposed feeling that comes from being briefly known. Most people drown that kind of discomfort in noise or motion. They didn't. That refusal, unheroic and invisible, was the first sign that something in both of them was shifting. They didn't know it, but this stillness wasn't pushing them apart. It was quietly lining up their lives toward a choice neither of them had planned to face. Somewhere between routine and reflection, a connection was deepening without a single message exchanged. The turning point came weeks later, disguised as paperwork. Michael's company approved a long-term investment program focused on infrastructure and support services in underfunded public schools. On the surface, it was a strategic philanthropy move with favorable optics. In practice, it required someone to actually walk into those schools. Michael chose to attend the first visit himself. No cameras, no press release. Just a calendar block labeled with a neutral acronym most people ignored. He moved through hallways that smelled like old paint and cleaning solution, while administrators talked about timelines and projected impact. He nodded, asked a few questions, let their words wash past him. What caught his attention weren't the numbers. It was the kids threading their way through the corridors, sliding past him without a second glance. Their world didn't rearrange itself around him. No one paused to adjust their tone or posture because he was there. The lack of deference felt strangely bracing. Then, halfway down a hallway, he saw a boy step aside, watch an older maintenance worker struggle with an overloaded box, and quietly move to take one end. No prompting. No searching for an audience. Just simple help. Michael stopped. The conversation around him blurred. The worker thanked the boy. The boy flashed a quick smile, then jogged toward a classroom already late. The moment vanished as quickly as it arrived. To everyone else it was nothing. To Michael, it lodged itself in his mind like a question. Later that day, sitting in the principal's office, he asked to see a student roster, under the pretense of understanding the community better. He scanned names aimlessly until one pulled him up short. Evan Bennett. Recognition arrived like a slow tide, and then all at once. Claire's face. Her voice. The empty chair at the restaurant. He realized he'd never even asked her last name. Now he understood why their unfinished conversation had been following him. In the weeks that followed, Claire began noticing changes at Evan's school. Supplies that had always been lacking appeared without fanfare. Programs long discussed but never funded finally launched. Teachers seemed a little less frayed. Their emails tinged with something she hadn't seen in a while. Hope. She didn't dig for the story behind it. Life had taught her that sometimes good things came without clear origins, and cross-examining them could turn gratitude into suspicion. She chose to focus on what mattered. Evan's renewed excitement, his sense that school was a place where effort made a difference. Michael couldn't separate any of it from the boy in the hallway. This wasn't a case study or a line item anymore. It was a lived reality for one child who had been quietly generous when he thought no one was watching. He understood that kindness like that didn't come from policy. It came from home, repeated in 100 tiny decisions. Systems mattered, but people made them meaningful or hollow. He surprised his executive team by requesting deeper involvement in the school initiative. He didn't want just updates. He wanted to see what happened between the statistics. This wasn't a branding exercise or a private absolution. It was the first time in years that something in his work felt undeniably human. Underneath the formal language of budgets and deliverables, a personal decision was taking shape. He could no longer pretend distance was neutral. He didn't broadcast his new focus. He just shifted his calendar. He stayed longer on school visits, asked real questions, stayed quiet when the answers didn't fit neatly into a slide deck. Teachers spoke about burnout, about juggling too many roles with too few resources. Students talked about feeling invisible or written off. Support staff described doing everything they could with what little they had. Michael listened without jumping to solutions, absorbing how distant this reality was from the sanitized summaries he was used to. Over time, his presence stopped being an event and became part of the background. He learned names, noticed which kids always hung back, which teachers stayed late, which staff members knew every child's story. He saw posture change when adults realized they weren't being evaluated, just heard. He watched how a simple, genuine question could shift the mood of a whole room. Efficiency, he realized, wasn't always the highest form of respect. Often attention did more. Claire watched these improvements from the outside, unaware of the man behind them. What she saw was Evan. More animated, more confident, more eager to share his day. Teacher messages came more often and carried not only concerns but appreciation. She received it all cautiously. Gratitude came naturally to her. Uncritical trust did not. She knew how easily stability could evaporate if its foundation was someone else's whims. The first time she saw Michael again, it was at dismissal. He stood near the fence, dressed in a way that made him blend rather than stand out, hands in his pockets, watching without inserting himself. At first, she didn't connect him to the man from the restaurant. When she did, she paused, not from shock but from recalculation. He caught her gaze and offered a brief nod instead of a smile, leaving the next move up to her. He only approached when she stepped slightly closer, indicating she was willing to talk. He asked about the school, spoke about how impressed he was by the students, mentioned the small acts of kindness he'd seen that would never appear in any report. He did not talk about his role in any of it. Claire listened, measuring each word against the man she remembered. She noticed how carefully he avoided centering himself. Their early conversations stayed anchored in what they saw around them. No trading of histories, no sudden vulnerability. She talked about raising Evan to notice people instead of status. Michael received it without trying to turn her principles into a mirror for his own. It wasn't intimacy. It was a quiet form of trust built on the simple fact that he kept showing up the same way. Back at the office, not everyone appreciated the shift. In meetings, His colleagues began to couch their unease in strategic language. They questioned whether this hands-on involvement was the best use of his time, wondered aloud if emotional investment might cloud judgment. Years ago, Michael would have agreed with them. That realization disturbed him more than their skepticism. He saw, perhaps for the first time, how neatly the systems he'd mastered set feelings aside whenever they made decisions more complicated. Distance streamlined everything, but distance also sterilized it. He couldn't walk away now without lying to them, to himself. This wasn't about being liked or admired. It was about refusing to detach from something that had become real just because it was inconvenient. The opposition he felt around the board table only clarified the line he was drawing inside himself. During this time, the space between Michael and Claire grew quieter, but not colder. When they spoke, she didn't pretend her worries were small. She told him plainly that Evan's independence was sacred to her, that she would not allow gratitude to turn into obligation. Michael didn't rush to reassure. He listened, aware that trust couldn't be reasoned into existence. It had to be proven repeatedly, especially with someone who had so much to protect. That mutual restraint created a fragile equilibrium. Not closeness, but something sturdy enough to lean on lightly. Evan, tuned in the way children often are, sensed the tension even if he didn't know its source. One night, while they worked on a project at the kitchen table, he asked Claire whether helping people always made life more complicated. The question stunned her with its accuracy. She answered slowly, telling him that sometimes doing the right thing invited questions rather than praise. That didn't make it wrong. That truth, spoken for him, was something she needed to hear herself. Michael's clearest test came in a meeting with a senior investor who pulled him aside afterward. With silky concern, the man suggested that emotional decisions could weaken leadership. That predictability was what people trusted, and involvement at this level looked unpredictable. The comment followed him out of the building and into the night. He knew that stepping back from the school, and from whatever was forming with Claire, would immediately smooth things. His reputation would remain spotless. His choices would once again be unassailable. For the first time, that path felt like the dishonest one. As pressure mounted on both of them, Claire from sideways glances at school events, Michael from boardroom subtext, the connection between them reached a stretching point. Not a break, a test. Kindness, once it becomes visible, asks to be owned. They both understood that staying neutral now would require more effort than choosing a side. The question was no longer whether this bond mattered. It was whether they were willing to shoulder the responsibility that came with it, without shrinking it into something tidier. The next shift arrived without speeches. During a small school fundraiser, Claire was asked to help sort donated materials in a cramped side office. She stacked folders, straightened envelopes, and tried not to think about how many hours of unpaid labor went into keeping schools like this afloat. Tucked into one of the folders was a handwritten letter clipped to a financial report. She almost put it aside. Then she saw Evan's name in the first few lines. The letter wasn't addressed to anyone. Michael had written it months earlier, alone late at night, trying to make sense of why one small moment at a school hallway had stayed with him when so many others faded. In restrained, measured language, he described watching a boy quietly help a maintenance worker, and recognizing that kind of instinct as the product of years of modeled behavior. Not luck or special opportunity. He didn't glorify Evan. He simply named him as evidence that something at home was going right. Then he wrote about the boy's mother, the woman he'd met once in a restaurant when both of them had been stood up. He wrote about how her calm, unperformed honesty that night had reminded him of the person he used to be before success had required armor. He confessed that he'd never reached out, not because he didn't want to, but because her life looked carefully balanced, and he didn't want to throw his weight onto it. There was no pleading in the letter. No imagined future. Just observation and a level of vulnerability he didn't offer anyone else. Claire felt the words settle into her with a complicated mix of discomfort and recognition. When Michael realized she'd found and read the letter, he didn't lunge for an explanation. He stood in the doorway of the little office, hands loose at his sides, letting the silence arrive first. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said quietly. "But there's nothing in it I'd take back." For the first time since they met, he talked openly about his loneliness, about how achievement had slowly pushed out connection. about how seeing Evan, and by extension her, had woken up something he'd assumed was permanently shut down. Claire met honesty with honesty. She told him she had spent years guarding herself against unevenness, convinced that closeness always came with a hidden cost. The letter, she admitted, forced her to consider the possibility that some people could care without acquiring, could be present without angling for a deeper claim. She didn't promise trust. She didn't offer more than she had. She simply acknowledged that what he felt, and the way he had handled it, mattered. That alone was movement. Their conversation didn't solve anything neatly. It didn't define what they were to each other. But it brought whatever existed between them out of the shadows. From that moment, their connection wasn't a vague impression. It had contours.
Intention.
Wait. Michael understood that drifting at the edge of their lives was no longer an option. Claire recognized that keeping everyone at arm's length cost her something too. Neither choice before them, continued distance or deeper involvement, looked easy. Both were honest. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was dense with everything neither of them could say yet. Claire found herself more rattled by his restraint than by what the letter revealed. He had felt all of this and chosen not to push his way into her life, not to send the letter, not to leverage his position at the school for personal access. For years she had measured safety by distance. Now she was being confronted with a different kind of safety, someone strong enough to stay back unless invited. Michael, standing across from her, felt more exposed than he ever had in front of a board, a media interview, or a hostile negotiation. He was used to curating which parts of himself were visible. Here he had no control over how she would sort what she'd just seen. He didn't move closer. He didn't rush to soften her reaction or fill the air with comfort. He let the reality stand and surrendered his ability to spin it. That was his risk. Claire noticed the missing pressure.
No persuasión.
No suggestion that they were now bound together by some unspoken promise. That absence gave her something she rarely had. Room to choose without being nudged. For a brief span of time, they stood between the lives that had shaped them and a future that might demand different rules.
No declarations.
No tashing. Just a shared willingness not to hide or run. The restraint itself became an act of respect. Then they stepped out of the small office and back into the fundraiser's noise. Kids laughing, announcements over a crackling microphone, the faint smell of burnt coffee. Nothing around them looked different. But something in both of them had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. The letter hadn't created intimacy. It had erased pretense. From now on, anything that grew between them would be the result of deliberate choice, not accident. That night, Evan sensed a change he couldn't name. He watched his mother more than usual, noticing how her attention felt softer somehow, less braced against the world. When he asked if something had happened, she told him that sometimes people show you who they really are when they don't know you're looking. Seeing that, she said, didn't mean you had to trust them right away, but it did mean you owed them respect. Across town, Michael left the fundraiser with no clearer idea of what would come next, but with more clarity than he'd had in years about what he wanted to stand for. He understood now that kindness didn't grant him rights. It offered him responsibilities. Whatever path opened from here would require patience, consistency, and an acceptance that nothing might come of it beyond knowing he had acted in alignment with who he wanted to be. The story between them had changed without a single dramatic scene. Silence could no longer function as protection. From here, any next step would be intentional. And that intention would determine whether this bond became something enduring or remained a single lesson in how to choose differently. Resolution did not arrive as a sweeping change. It came as a string of ordinary decisions. Michael did not vanish from the school to appease his critics. He didn't flood it with attention either, trying to prove a point. He kept showing up on the same schedule in the same way. Claire noticed. The predictability allowed attention in her shoulders to ease, just slightly. Reliability, she realized, often mattered more than intensity. Their conversations, when they happened, grew more candid. They talked about limits, about fear, about the lives they'd built long before they ever sat 2 tables apart in a restaurant. Michael admitted that success had trained him to control outcomes, not to sit with uncertainty. Claire admitted that independence, while protective, sometimes left her with very little space for being supported. They didn't treat these as wounds for the other to heal, Just truths placed on the table between them, not asking to be fixed. Evan remained the constant thread binding their worlds. He continued thriving at school, unaware of the deeper shifts happening just outside his line of sight. Claire watched the way Michael interacted with her son. Respectful, careful, deliberate. He never reached for a role that wasn't his. He offered presence, not position. That discipline meant more to her than any declaration could have. For Michael, this was a new kind of effort. Being present without performance. Listening rather than directing. Allowing moments to unfold without steering them toward a particular conclusion. Felt awkward at times. Uncertain. But also undeniably real. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't chasing meaning through achievement. He was allowing connection to exist on its own terms. One evening, after another school event wound down and families drifted toward their cars, Claire and Michael walked side by side across the dim parking lot. Evan trotted a few steps ahead, swinging his backpack, humming to himself. No one rushed to fill the silence. The ordinariness of it, the asphalt underfoot, the cool air, the boy in front of them, felt unexpectedly profound. Life didn't need reinvention. It needed attention. Near the cars, Michael turned to her. "Would you like to get coffee sometime?" he asked. "Just continue the conversation." He didn't label it. Didn't lean on charm. He left the question as simple as it sounded. Claire didn't answer right away. She thought about the lines she'd drawn, the ones she'd already allowed to blur, the stakes she carried that he didn't. When she finally said yes, it wasn't because she felt swept into anything. It was because the offer matched the pace she could live with. That distinction mattered to both of them. Their coffee came without fanfare. No grand restaurant, just a quiet place where mugs clinked and no one looked twice at them. No speeches, no attempts to define what they were doing. They talked about ordinary things. Work rhythms, small moments from childhood that had stayed with them, the habits they wanted to break, and the ones they were secretly proud of. Nothing explosive happened. Yet with each honest sentence, the ground solidified a little more. They weren't rushing toward a label or an ending. They were letting something grow slowly enough to see it clearly. When they parted that afternoon, there was no dramatic farewell. Only a shared sense that something had begun. Not a rescue, not a guarantee, but a choice to stay open a little longer. A choice to see what kindness, practiced with intention, might build between two people who had spent years avoiding exactly this kind of risk. They walked back into their separate lives carrying a quiet certainty. Goodness still existed, not in grand gestures, but in patient, steady attention to what mattered. If this story found its way into your heart, you can stay close for more like it. Follow along, turn on your reminders, and if you'd like, tell us where you're listening from. There are more stories coming about ordinary people, small choices, and the quiet ways they change everything.